She stood at the edge of the ballroom, a champagne flute trembling in her hand, and realized she had been holding her breath for a year. The orchestra played a waltz that coiled through the candle-lit air like a cruel joke, and her husband, the Duke of Thornwood, was dancing with Lady Cecily Ashford. His hand rested at the small of the widow's back with an ease that Evelyn had never felt against her own skin. He leaned down and murmured something that made the woman laugh, a soft, intimate sound that cut through the murmur of the ton. Evelyn's chest tightened. She did not look away because she was too proud to let anyone see her break. Instead, she let her gaze drift over the shifting silks and glittering jewels, over the faces that turned toward her with pity or poorly concealed amusement. She was the Duchess of Thornwood, yet in that moment she was less than a ghost. A ghost would have been more noticed. The whispers had started months ago, quiet at first, then bolder. Now they were so loud they hardly bothered to hide. He never speaks to her, did you see? Her father practically bought the title for her. What did she expect? She looks so thin, poor thing. And he dances with Lady Cecily again. Evelyn swallowed the ache in her throat and set the champagne down on a passing tray. She had worn a gown of pale silver tonight, hoping he might look at her. She had spent an hour arranging her hair, hoping he might notice. But Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Thornwood, had walked past her in the entrance hall as if she were a piece of furniture, offering only a curt nod before escorting his mother, the Dowager Duchess, into the carriage. He had not offered his arm to his wife. He had not said a single word. That was the moment the last thread of hope inside her snapped. Not dramatically, not with a cry, but quietly, like a candle burning out. She had been holding on for a year, through the cold silences at breakfast, through the nights when his study door remained locked, through the endless, aching loneliness of their grand estate. She had told herself love might grow, that she only needed patience, that the man who had married her out of duty would one day see her. But a year of invisible devotion had taught her a bitter truth. You cannot make a heart choose you. And so, standing at the edge of the ballroom with the shattered remains of her pride, Evelyn Ashford made a decision. She would stop. She would stop waiting, stop hopping, stop loving a man who did not even see her. The Duchess turned, her silver skirts sweeping the marble floor, and walked out of the ballroom alone. The marriage had been forged in the cold logic of necessity. The Thornwood estate was crumbling under generations of debt, and Alexander had inherited a title that was more burden than honor. He was a proud man, raised by a mother who believed the Blackwood name was worth more than gold, and the shame of near ruin had carved deep furrows into his soul. When Evelyn's father, a wealthy merchant baron, offered an enormous dowry in exchange for a ducal alliance, Alexander had gritted his teeth and accepted. He had told himself it was duty, that preserving the estate and the livelihoods of the tenants mattered more than his own pride. But pride has a way of souring into resentment, and on their wedding day, as he looked at the hopeful, luminous bride walking toward him, all he could see was the price of his own failure. He had been sold to save Thornwood. He had not chosen her. He had merely paid the cost. Evelyn had arrived at the estate with a heart full of nervous dreams. She had known it was a marriage of convenience, but she was young, and the Duke was handsome, and somewhere deep inside she believed that if she loved him enough, he would love her back. The first weeks were a careful, fragile dance. She would rise early to join him for breakfast, asking gentle questions about his plans for the day. He would answer in monosyllables, his eyes never lifting from his correspondence. She would walk the gardens and gather flowers for the drawing room, hoping he might comment on the splash of color. He never did. In the evenings she would sit in the library, pretending to read, waiting for him to come in from his study. When he finally did, he would pause at the threshold, nod, and retire to his chambers without a word. Each night she would climb into the vast, empty bed and stare at the canopy above, wondering what was so deeply wrong with her that she could not even earn a glance from her own husband. The Dowager Duchess made it worse. Beatrice Blackwood was a woman carved from ice and old resentment. She had never approved of the match, and she made Evelyn's life a quiet misery of arched eyebrows and barbed comments delivered with a smile. "My dear, That color does nothing for your complexion, but I suppose you are not accustomed to society's expectations. The servants tell me you were in the village again. The Duchess of this house does not meddle with farmers. You must learn your place." Eveline learned to lower her eyes and say nothing, because defending herself only seemed to amuse the older woman. And Alexander, when he was present, never once intervened. Whether he did not care or simply did not notice, Eveline could not tell. Both possibilities cut equally deep. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon in late autumn, 2 months after the ball. Eveline was walking through the east wing, returning from the still room where she had been helping Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, prepare remedies for a tenant's sick child. It was a small, meaningful work, the only kind that made her feel remotely useful in a house that did not want her. As she passed the Dowager Duchess's sitting room, she heard voices through the half-open door. Her mother-in-law's tone was cool and sharp. "You cannot keep ignoring her forever, Alexander. The ton talks. It is embarrassing." A pause, then her husband's voice, tired and clipped. "I have given her a title, a home, and every comfort. She wants for nothing. She wants for a husband who looks at her. Then she is a fool to expect what was never part of the arrangement. I married her for the estate, not for sentiment. She knew that." Eveline's hand flew to her mouth. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart crashing so loudly she was certain they would hear it. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with the casual indifference of a man discussing a business transaction. She had known it, of course, on some level. But to hear it spoken aloud, to hear the cold finality in his voice, was a blade she was not prepared for. She had not been a fool to hope, she had been human. But now she understood that hope was a wound she had been inflicting on herself every single day. Something inside her shifted. She did not cry. She had cried too many nights already. Instead, a strange, steady calm settled over her like a winter frost. If her love was not wanted, she would not force it upon him. She would not beg. She would become a duchess in name only, and she would find a way to live without the one thing she had so desperately craved. The next morning, Eveline did not come down to breakfast. Alexander noticed the change, but only in the way one notices a familiar piece of furniture has been moved. The morning table was quieter without her hesitant attempts at conversation. The drawing room felt larger. At first, he told himself he was relieved. No more careful glances, no more hopeful smiles that made him feel like a villain for his own coldness. He buried himself in estate ledgers and correspondence, convincing himself that peace was preferable. But peace has a peculiar weight when it is born from absence, and over the following weeks, that weight began to press against his conscience. He saw her less and less. When they did cross paths, she would curtsy politely, murmur a greeting, and glide past him with a serenity that felt entirely wrong. There was no longer a question in her eyes, no lingering hope, just stillness. One evening he watched her from the window as she walked through the garden with the head gardener, her head bent in genuine interest as the old man gestured toward the new rose beds. She laughed at something he said, a soft, bright sound that Alexander had not heard in months. The laugh was not for him. It never would be again. He turned away from the window, his jaw tight, and told himself the hollow ache in his chest was indigestion. Then Viscount Linton arrived. Charles Linton was a neighbor who had been abroad for several years and had returned to claim his family's modest estate. He was not wealthy, not particularly powerful, but he had a warmth that drew people like sunlight. When he was introduced to Eveline at a small dinner party at Thornwood Hall, he did not treat her as a burdensome appendage to the Duke. He listened when she spoke. He asked her opinion on a book she had been reading. He made her smile twice. Alexander, seated at the head of the table, watched the exchange with a strange, simmering irritation he could not name. His wife's smile was directed at another man, and something primal and possessive stirred deep in his gut. After dinner, the Viscount lingered near the fireplace with Eveline, their voices low and easy. Alexander stood across the room, a glass of brandy in his hand, pretending to listen to a local magistrate drone on about taxes, but his attention kept drifting back to the Duchess. She was animated in a way he had never seen. Her cheeks held a soft flush. Her hands gestured gracefully as she described something, and Linton leaned in, captivated. When the Viscount reached out and briefly touched her wrist in a gesture of shared amusement, Alexander's fingers tightened around the glass until he feared it would shatter. Jealousy is an ugly, unwelcome guest. It arrives without invitation and makes itself at home in the coldest corners of the heart. Alexander had never considered himself a jealous man, because he had never allowed himself to care enough to be threatened. But now, watching his wife glow under another man's attention, he felt a possessive anguish that shocked him. She was his. Legally, yes, but more than that, she had been his in the quiet, unassuming way that she had offered her heart from the very beginning. And he had thrown it away without a second thought. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had not simply been distant, he had been cruel. He had let her wither in his own house, and now someone else was watering her, and the flower that was blooming was not for him. He excused himself abruptly and strode toward the pair. Eveline looked up as he approached, her expression cooling instantly. The transformation was so swift it left him momentarily speechless. The warmth she had shown Linton vanished behind a polite, neutral mask. "Your Grace," she said, the title a wall between them. "Lord Linton was just telling me about his travels in Italy. Did you know he lived in Florence for 2 years?" "I did not," Alexander said, his voice stiffer than he intended. He turned to the Viscount. "Linton, I trust your estate is recovering from your absence. I would not wish to keep you from your responsibilities with overly long evening visits." The implication was subtle but unmistakable. The Viscount, a perceptive man, inclined his head with a gentle smile. "Of course, Your Grace. I was just taking my leave. Duchess, it was a genuine pleasure. I hope we may continue our conversation another time." "I would like that," Evelyn said softly, and the words cut Alexander deeper than any insult. Linton bowed and departed, leaving husband and wife standing in an uncomfortable silence. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. "You were very friendly with him," Alexander said finally, the words coming out colder than he meant. Eveline lifted her chin, and for the first time in a year, her eyes met his without a trace of deference. "Is there a rule against being friendly, Your Grace? I was not aware that conversing with a guest was forbidden." "It is not forbidden, but you are the Duchess of Thornwood. There are appearances to consider." She let out a soft, humorless breath that was almost a laugh. "Appearances, of course. Forgive me, I momentarily forgot that my purpose is to be a silent ornament in your house." She gathered her shawl around her shoulders. "If you will excuse me, I am tired. Good night, Your Grace." He watched her ascend the staircase, each step deliberate and unhurried, and felt the distance between them stretch into an uncrossable chasm. He wanted to call after her. He wanted to explain that he did not know how to do this, that he had built walls so high he could no longer see over them. But his pride held his tongue, and the silence swallowed him whole. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet agony for the Duke. Eveline no longer avoided him. She simply ceased to orient her life around him. She spent her mornings in the village, visiting the sick and helping at the small school that she had quietly funded with the remains of her personal allowance. The tenants adored her. When Alexander rode through the estate, he heard her name on every grateful tongue. "The Duchess brought medicine for my boy. Her Grace sent a cart of firewood when the frost came. We are blessed to have her, Your Grace, truly blessed." Each word was a mirror reflecting his own neglect. She was everything a duchess should be, and he had done nothing to earn her loyalty. He had given her a cold hearth and a colder bed, and in return she had poured warmth into every corner of his estate that he had ignored. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness he could not suppress, he went looking for her. He found her in the garden, kneeling in the soil beside a young maid, teaching her how to properly plant lavender. Her hands were dirty, her hair slipping loose from its pins, and she was laughing at something the maid said. The sound struck him like an arrow. He had not heard her laugh in so long, not freely like this. She looked up and saw him, and the laughter died. Her face composed itself into that calm, courteous mask. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" "No, I merely wondered where you were." "I am here." She brushed dirt from her apron and stood. "Was there something you needed?" The word lodged in his throat but would not come out. He needed her to look at him the way she used to, with those wide, hopeful eyes. He needed her to stop calling him Your Grace as if he were a stranger. He needed to go back in time and become the man she deserved. "No," he said at last. "Nothing." She nodded, turned back to the lavender, and resumed her lesson. He stood there for a long, agonizing moment, invisible in his own garden, before walking away. The first emotional revelation came like a thunderclap on a quiet Sunday. The Dowager Duchess had gone to London for a fortnight, leaving the house oddly peaceful. Alexander was in his study, sorting through a stack of neglected correspondence, when Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, knocked hesitantly and entered. She was a woman of solid, unshakable calm, but her hands were trembling as she held out a small bundle of papers. "Your Grace, I would not intrude, but I found these in the grate of the Duchess's sitting room. She had tried to burn them, but the fire did not catch. I thought you should see." He took the bundle, frowning. The papers were letters, fine stationery now smudged with ash. The handwriting was his mother. A cold dread settled in his stomach as he unfolded the first one. "To the woman who calls herself Duchess. You must think yourself very clever, worming your way into a house that will never accept you. My son may tolerate your presence for the sake of the estate, but do not mistake tolerance for affection. He married your dowry, not you. Every time he looks at you, he sees the price of his shame. You are a tradesman's daughter playing dress-up, and the ton laughs at you behind your back. Do us all a favor and keep to the shadows where you belong." Alexander's hand shook as he read. There were more, dated over months and months. Some were cruel observations about her appearance. Others mocked her attempts to learn the ways of the aristocracy. One accused her of trapping him with her father's money. The words were venomous, deliberate, and relentless, and she had received these alone, in silence, never once bringing them to him. She had burned them, but the words had already seared themselves into her soul. He sat there for a long time, staring at the hateful script, and felt something inside him fracture. He had allowed this. He had created a house so cold that his wife had no safe place to bring such cruelty. He had stood by while his mother's barbs found their mark, too absorbed in his own resentment to see the bleeding. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing and absolute. He found Eveline in the library that evening, curled into a window seat with a book. The sunset painted her in shades of gold and rose, and she looked so peaceful that he almost could not bear to disturb her. But he had to. He cleared his throat. She looked up, and for once he saw a flicker of alarm before she hid it. "Your Grace." He walked toward her, the letters clutched in his hand. "Why did you never show me these?" Her gaze dropped to the papers, and the color drained from her face. She closed her book slowly. "They were not meant for you. They were from my mother attacking my wife. That makes them my concern." His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "She has been sending these for months. Why did you not come to me?" Eveline stood, wrapping her arms around herself as if against a chill. "What would you have done, Alexander?" She used his name for the first time in weeks, and it stung like a benediction he did not deserve. "Would you have believed me? Would you have confronted her? You have never once defended me. I learned very early in this marriage that I am alone here, so I endured. That is what I do." Each word was measured, not angry, just exhausted, and that was far worse. An angry wife could be soothed. A defeated wife was a monument to his failure. He stepped closer, the letters crumpling in his fist. "You are not alone. You were never alone. I simply—" He stopped, the admission sticking in his throat. "I did not know how to be what you needed." She looked at him then, really looked, and there was a glimmer of the old softness beneath the ice. But it was faint and fragile. "I did not need you to be perfect, Alexander. I only needed you to be present. You were not. And I cannot keep bleeding for someone who does not want my heart." She turned and left the room, her footsteps light and final. He stood in the gathering darkness, the vile letters spilling from his hand like dead leaves, and finally truly understood the depth of his loss. The second revelation came less than a week later, when a letter arrived from Eveline's father. The old merchant had fallen ill and was not expected to travel again. He wrote to his daughter with a tenderness that made Alexander's chest ache, and in a postscript added a casual note. "I trust the restoration of Ashwood Manor proceeds well. It comforts me to know that my sacrifice was not in vain, and that the home your mother loved will stand again." Alexander read the letter over Eveline's shoulder with her quiet permission, and the postscript puzzled him. He turned to her. "Ashwood Manor, I thought your father sold it years ago to fund his business ventures." Eveline's face tightened. She took the letter back, folding it carefully. "He did not sell it. He surrendered it as part of my dowry. The entirety of the estate was signed over to Thornwood in order to secure the alliance. My childhood home, Alexander, was the price of our marriage." The air left his lungs. He had known the dowry was substantial, a fortune that had single-handedly pulled Thornwood from the brink of ruin. But he had never known, had never thought to ask, where that wealth came from. He had assumed it was coin and investments, not the sacrifice of an entire ancestral estate. Eveline had given up her own home, her own legacy, to stand beside a man who had not even given her a kind word, and she had never mentioned it. She had borne the loss quietly without reproach, while he sulked and resented her. "I did not know," he whispered, his voice hollow. "No," she said, her tone flat. "You did not ask. You never asked anything about me, Alexander. You saw the dowry and you saw the inconvenience of a wife, and that was all." Her words were not a lashing out. They were a simple statement of fact, and that made them unendurable. He stood there, frozen, as she left him alone with the weight of his own staggering blindness. He had called her a fool for hopping, but he was the greatest fool of all. He had been given a treasure beyond measure, and he had treated it like a burden. That night the Duke of Thornwood sat in his study and did not touch a single ledger. Instead, he wrote a letter to his steward, instructing him to begin the immediate restoration of Ashwood Manor, funded entirely from his personal accounts. He would give her back her home. It was a small, pitiful gesture compared to what he owed her, but it was a start. The breaking point arrived with the first snow of winter. A grand Christmas ball was being held at the estate of the Marquis of Dunmore, and attendance was all but required. Alexander and Eveline traveled together in strained silence, the carriage filled with unspoken words. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that made her look like a queen, and he could not take his eyes off her. She did not notice. Her gaze was fixed on the frosted window, her thoughts clearly miles away. At the ball, history repeated itself with a cruel twist. Lord Linton was there, and when he saw Eveline, his face lit up with undisguised pleasure. He approached and claimed her for a waltz before Alexander could even offer his arm. The Duke stood on the sidelines, his chest tight, and watched his wife glide across the floor in another man's embrace. She was smiling, a real smile, the kind that had once been his to earn. He had never earned it. He had never even tried. When the dance ended, Linton escorted her back toward the refreshment table, his hand lingering at her elbow. Alexander intercepted them, his expression rigid. "I believe the next dance is mine," he said, more a demand than a request. Eveline studied him for a long moment. Her eyes searched his face, and whatever she saw there made her posture soften just a fraction. "Very well," she said. It was their first dance in months. His hand settled at her waist, and the contact sent a jolt through him. She was so close, so achingly familiar and yet a stranger. The orchestra played a slow, mournful air, and they moved in careful, stilted steps. He stared down at her, and the words that had been lodged in his heart for weeks began to claw their way out. "Eveline," he said, his voice low and strained, "I need to speak with you, not here, after. There is nothing to say that cannot be said here." "Yes, there is." He tightened his hold, drawing her a fraction closer. "I have been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I pushed you away because I was too proud to admit that I needed you, that I needed this marriage to be more than a transaction. I was afraid afraid that if I let myself care, I would lose you the way I lost everything else. So I built a fortress and left you standing outside in the cold. And you bore it with a grace I did not deserve. I see that now." Her steps faltered. She looked up at him, and her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I am terrified," he admitted, the confession ripping from his chest like a wound torn open. "Terrified that it is too late, that I have lost you to silence, to my own cruelty, to a man who actually sees your worth. I see you now, Evelyn. I see you in every part of my house, in every grateful face on my land, in every corner of my empty heart. I have loved you too late, but I love you. I love you." The music stopped. The room was still. She pulled away from him, her breath coming fast, and fled toward the terrace. He followed without hesitation, leaving behind the curious stares and the scandalized whispers. The cold night air bit at his skin as he stepped outside. She was standing by the stone balustrade, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice breaking. "You cannot spend a year making me feel invisible and then suddenly decide you love me. It does not work that way. My heart is not a switch you can turn on and off." "No." He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. "I am not asking you to turn it on. I am asking you to let me earn it, let me try. I will spend the rest of my life trying if you will let me. I will tear down every wall. I will never let my mother's poison touch you again. I will give you back your home, the one you sacrificed for a man who did not even say thank you. I have already begun the restoration. Ashwood Manor will stand again, and it will be yours freely, no strings attached." Her head snapped up, shock parting her lips. You are restoring Ashwood." "I started the day I found out. I cannot undo the past, but I can try to make amends. I can try to be the husband you deserved from the start." He took a tentative step forward. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, so I will not ask. I will simply offer myself, broken and late as I am, and hope that one day you might look at me again the way you did when we first married. With hope." Evelyn stared at him, her chest heaving. The tears did not stop, but something in her expression shifted. It was not an immediate melting, but a crack in the ice, a small, fragile breach through which a light might eventually pour. She wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers. "I loved you," she whispered, "so much that it nearly destroyed me. I do not know if I can ever trust you with that love again." "I will wait," he said, his voice raw. "I will wait as long as it takes, even if it takes a lifetime." She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not pull away when he reached for her hand. His fingers, cold and unsteady, wrapped gently around hers. She did not intertwine them, but she did not let go. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Healing is a slow, uneven process, full of setbacks and silences and moments of doubt. But the Duke of Thornwood kept his word. He confronted his mother upon her return, and when the Dowager Duchess sneered and refused to apologize, he quietly arranged for her to take up permanent residence at the Dower house on the far edge of the estate. The letters stopped. The cold looks vanished. For the first time, Thornwood Hall felt like a home rather than a battleground. Alexander spent his days learning his wife anew. He joined her on her visits to the village, standing awkwardly at first, then gradually finding his place as the man who carried firewood and held sick children while she administered medicine. He walked with her through the garden, asking about the lavender and genuinely listening to her answers. He had his steward deliver weekly reports on the progress at Ashwood Manor, and he shared them with Evelyn over tea, watching her eyes brighten at the thought of her childhood home rising from neglect. And at night, he would sit with her in the library, not demanding conversation, just present. Sometimes she would read aloud. Sometimes they would sit in companionable silence. Each small moment was a brick in a bridge he was determined to build. One evening in early spring, when the first green shoots were pushing through the thawed earth, they walked together to the garden's old stone bench beneath the willow tree. The sunset blazed orange and pink, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of damp soil. Evelyn was wearing a simple muslin dress, her hair loose, and she looked more beautiful than any duchess had a right to look. She turned to him, and in her eyes was not the distant politeness of before, nor the wary caution, but something softer. Something that trembled on the edge of renewal. "Alexander," she said, his name a gift she was still learning to give freely. "I have been thinking about us." He braced himself, his heart hammering. "Yes. I cannot promise I will not flinch when old memories surface. I cannot promise I will not sometimes doubt. But I have watched you these past months, and I have seen the man you are choosing to become. It is not too late. Perhaps it never was." She reached up and with a shyness that made his throat tight, laid her palm against his cheek. "I am ready to try with you." The breath he released was half a sob. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it closer, and closed his eyes against the sting of tears. "I do not deserve you," he murmured, "but I will spend every day of my life becoming worthy." She smiled, a real, luminous smile, the one he had feared lost forever. "You do not need to become worthy, Alexander. You only need to stay, to be here. That is all I ever wanted." He pulled her gently into his arms, and she came willingly, her head tucking beneath his chin as if it had always belonged there. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in the dying light, the silence no longer empty but full of unspoken promises. The willow branches swayed above them like a blessing. When they finally walked back to the house, hand in hand, the servants who saw them exchanged glances of quiet, joyful disbelief. The Duchess was laughing at something the Duke said, and the Duke was looking at her as if she were the sunrise itself. And in that moment, Thornwood Hall, which had been a cold monument to duty and pride, became something else entirely. It became a home. The restoration of Ashwood Manor was completed by midsummer, and Alexander presented the deed to Evelyn on her birthday, wrapped in a ribbon the color of forget-me-nots. She wept, and he held her, and that night they talked until dawn about her childhood, her mother, the dreams she had shelved when she became a duchess. He listened to every word. He promised to help her realize those dreams. And slowly, patiently, love grew back from the scorched earth of a broken marriage. It was not the naive, desperate love of a hopeful bride. It was a love that had been tested, scarred, and chosen anew. It was stronger for its fractures. And one warm autumn afternoon, as they stood side by side, overlooking the newly planted lavender fields that now stretched behind Thornwood Hall, Evelyn leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder and whispered, "I am glad I stopped loving you." He stiffened. "What?" She lifted her face, her eyes dancing with a gentle mischief. "Because when I stopped loving you, I started learning who I was. And when you finally came to me, it was not out of need or desperation. It was out of choice. You chose me, knowing the full cost. That is the love I always wanted. Not duty, not obligation, choice." He kissed her forehead, his lips lingering against her skin. "I chose you the moment I saw you, I think. I was just too frightened to admit it. But from now on, I will choose you every single day. Out loud, for the whole world to hear." And he did. He chose her at breakfast, offering her the first smile of the day. He chose her in the village, boasting about her charitable works to anyone who would listen. He chose her in the grand ballrooms of the Tun, where now he danced every first waltz with his wife, his eyes never leaving her face. He chose her in the quiet, sacred hours of night, when she fell asleep with her hand in his, the cold, vast bed no longer empty but filled with warmth and whispered words. The Tun whispered still, but now they whispered about the Duke of Thornwood's devotion, about the transformation of a marriage that had been a notorious failure into a legendary romance. Some said it was a miracle, others said it was a lesson, but those who truly knew the story understood that it was neither. It was simply the result of two people who had lost each other in the dark and fought their way back toward the light. Pain to hope, distance to jealousy, regret to fear of loss, confession to healing. The full circle closed at last. And when, years later, their daughter asked her mother how she had known the Duke truly loved her, Evelyn smiled and stroked the child's hair and said, "Because he loved me when I could not love myself. And when I had no love left to give him, he gave me his anyway freely until I could return it." In the doorway unseen, the Duke of Thornwood stood listening, his eyes bright with an old, fierce tenderness. He had almost lost her. He had almost spent a lifetime behind walls of his own making, but she had waited even when she had stopped waiting. She had endured. And now, in the golden, ordinary miracle of their everyday life, he finally understood that love was not a transaction or a duty. It was a choice, made again and again, with every sunrise, with every breath. He stepped into the room and lifted his daughter into his arms, then reached for his wife's hand. She twined her fingers through his without hesitation, and together they walked into the next chapter, leaving the darkness behind, carrying only the light.